Welcome to Calm Historian, where tonight we open royal romps with a quiet stroll through The Royal Skeleton's Closet by Emanuele Del Rosso, Italy, 2021. A gentle look at how whispered affairs shaped crowns and courts. Before we begin, please comment with your location and your current local time. If you enjoy calm journeys through the past, please like and subscribe. On the cover of a neat Italian volume, The Royal Skeleton's Closet by Emanuele Del Rosso, published in 2021 and bearing his copyright, the past looks like a drawing room of half-lit secrets, gilt edges, a spine worn by repeated consultations, a promise that the glitter of crowns often hides a darker domestic ledger. The book's title sits beside a short dispatch written for a wider audience, a piece by David Moricond, filed on 5/05/2023 at 7:20 GMT+2, and later updated at 8:37. That is the scene, the quiet authority of a printed work, the crisp timestamp of an article, before the greater drama begins to unfold. When fairy tale weddings reveal badly behaved royals, the contrast is sharper than anyone expects. Picture a bright aisle strewn with roses, the hush of an expectant crowd, camera lenses angling for the perfect, unblemished image of royal joy. Those images are meant to be simple and permanent, the storybook framing of vows and crowns. Yet just beyond the petals and the smiles, behind curtains and doors polished by centuries of ceremony, human desires and mistakes travel like a secret current. The language of pageantry, processions, tiaras, silver service, often acts as an elegant mask. When that mask slips, the revelations land with the force of thunder, sudden, loud, and impossible to ignore. Celebration and scandal share the same stage, each giving the other its meaning, and the result can redraw how we see both the people involved and the institution they represent. Before the coronation this weekend, Euronews Culture set out to trace that uneasy partnership. A coronation expects to be immutable, solemn, almost civilizational, yet it arrives carrying the memory of countless gatherings where dignity and impropriety have collided. In the days and weeks leading up to such a ceremony, attention focuses not just on choreography and crowns, but on the private histories that haunt public lives. Throughout British history, members of the royal family have had liaisons and been embroiled in a flurry of scandals. Read as a simple fact, that sounds like an archival note. Lived across generations, it becomes a long, complicated melody of attraction and consequence. There are clandestine meetings in shadowed corridors, a rustle of a letter passed beneath a table, a brief, charged exchange in a sunroom that will later be retold 1,000 times. Those private moments can ripple outward. Households reconfigured, reputations challenged, courtiers forced to choose sides. Scandal does more than tarnish a name. It reshapes alliances and sets the machinery of state and society humming with uneasy curiosity. The press room, that modern amphitheater, feeds on these collisions. Reporters and photographers take private missteps and turn them into public narratives. The public then devours and debates, alternately scandalized and forgiving. And in that back and forth, we see how fragile and human those who parade in regalia truly are. There is a peculiar beauty in the tension between ritual and impulse. Royal life offers ritual and spectacle, but it also invites us to examine our own contradictions. We applaud the pageant, and then lean closer to see where the seams begin. Moricond's brief dispatch and Del Rosso's denser investigations act as guides through this landscape, showing how romances and scandals do more than furnish headlines. They test institutions, illuminate character, and sometimes prompt reform. So, as coronation trumpets ready themselves this weekend, and millions tune in to watch ceremony and continuity play out on the public stage, there is a persistent, human subplot humming beneath the official music. History is not only made of proclamations and pageantry, it is also composed of whispered confidences and sometimes reckless choices. Those are the moments that make the monarchy both arresting and achingly human. Stories that continue to draw our attention, our judgment, and often our sympathy. Historically, royal marriages were rarely the stuff of fairy tales. They were political arrangements. Sons and daughters offered in carefully calculated exchanges to strengthen ties, expand influence, and at times, to shore up fragile bloodlines. Behind the ceremonial weddings and state banquets, there was always a ledger being balanced, alliances gained, risks minimized, and private lives negotiated as if they were another piece on a chessboard. Over the centuries, a quieter pattern began to show itself, a stubborn common denominator threading through generations. Infidelity, like an old family heirloom, moved from branch to branch, not always loudly, not always obvious, but often enough to leave a faint stain on the family portrait. Those posed smiles and glittering jewels could not fully hide the marks left when promises were broken or loyalties shifted. The public image held, even when the private picture had cracks. Behind the glittering ceremonies, in rooms closed by heavy curtains or down long, hushed corridors, human longing found ways to slip beyond the rules written for public life. Alliances frayed in the half-lights of private chambers, whispered words replaced vows, and letters, folded and unfolded in the dark, told stories that would never be read aloud. These were the places where dignity met desire, and where the neat lines of duty blurred into messy, intimate truth. Whenever those private failings threatened to seep into the light, the firm moved to contain them. Stories were smoothed over, explanations rehearsed, and uncomfortable chapters folded away. What could not be erased was softened, turned into rumor, tolerated in silence or locked behind official quiet. Across generations, the outward dignity of the institution was preserved by an inward insistence that certain truths be kept carefully, sometimes ruthlessly, out of sight. This particular public soap opera is far from an uplifting one. For better or worse, the royals and the British press live in a kind of uneasy partnership. Gossip feeds the papers, and the papers feed the monarchy a stream of attention that can be shaped into favorable coverage. Those romantic scandals, messy and intimate as they are, keep members of the family in the public eye. A constant reminder that duty and drama often travel together. The words come out low, deliberate, like a gavel finding its mark in a court that never sleeps. You can make whatever arrangements you need to find your own happiness. As long as you remember the one condition, you remain loyal to your husband and loyal to this family in public. He doesn't rush the sentence. Each clause falls into the room and hangs there. A calm, cool instruction wrapped in the velvet of a manner that has learned to conceal consequence beneath civility. Picture the room around that sentence. Thick curtains filter the light to a soft, muted glow. The hush of the palace presses against the glass. Conversation in these halls is never casual. Even when two people sit alone, every word is measured as if rehearsed for an audience of millions. When Prince Philip speaks in that tone, it carries the weight of decades, a lifetime of duty rendered into an austere kindness. He offers a concession, private happiness, and then draws a clear line. The public is a theater. Loyalty is the rule by which the players must live. That sentence is more than a demand. It is an arrangement spoken in the language of preservation. Protect the appearance, preserve the continuity, keep the family unbroken for those watching from outside. The words are precise, because precision is what the role requires. The blur of emotion must not spill into ceremonies, photographs, or headlines. Tucked inside the formality is both an implicit promise and a warning. If private choices are made, they must be carefully calibrated so they do not fracture the public story. For the person listening, those words are not abstract ideas but a map, with no landmarks for the heart. Whatever arrangements you need opens a door to survival and solace. Yet the stipulation, loyal to your husband and loyal to this family in public, snaps it shut again. It is a permission wrapped in fetters. Happiness is allowed, but only in a space that remains invisible to the world. Freedom is permitted, but only inside a cage whose bars are duty and optics. This is the anatomy of compromise. Personal life is carved into two halves: the private, which one may try to keep intact, and the public, which must be kept immaculate. The monarchy depends on that neat division. The public image, sustained by photos and press cycles, must outweigh the messy truth of private feelings. And if there is any tenderness in Philip's voice, a desire perhaps to protect what he can within those limits, it is tempered by the immutable rules he represents. The listener must choose, adapt, and carry on, aware that history will record not private truth, but public visage. The world will judge the mask, not the face underneath, and that knowledge shapes every small decision that follows. It is a form of survival that demands endless performance, a private navigation charted to avoid collision with the public eye. The sentence lingers like the last chord of a hymn, and in that echo, everything is revealed about both the institution and the individual. In the hush that follows, you can hear how monarchy translates into human terms, not as blunt command, but as carefully couched permissions that keep the machinery of state, sentiment, and spectacle running smoothly for those watching from outside. Royal marriages have never been simple, private promises. They are public events, proclamations made to a nation, an act that ties an individual heart to an institution built to outlast any single lifetime. On that stage, vows become a contract with history. Intimacy must share space with ceremony, and the personal is always measured against the weight of duty. For those born or married into the firm, that quiet, implacable machinery of palace life and protocol, marriage can begin to feel like an arranged arrangement. Not in the sense of force, but as a role to be learned, rehearsed and continually performed for the continuity of the crown. Ceremony, duty, and expectation settle over private feeling like a heavy cloak, and personal happiness can seem, at best, an indulgence reserved for the few. Prince Philip moved through this world with a naval bearing, a quick wit, and a privacy that could sometimes look bruised by publicity. His life was lived relentlessly in public view, and such close attention breeds its own stories, speculation, small persistent rumors and the half-formed whispers that cling to reputations. Throughout his marriage to the late Queen Elizabeth II, those whispers followed him, never presented as proven fact, but linked persistently by gossip and headline writers to figures like Patricia Kirkwood, the glamorous actress of stage lights, and Daphne du Maurier, the novelist whose brooding tales seem to cast their own shadow over real life. Still, the rumors never displaced the reality of duty. The marriage endured as the central anchor for both sovereign and consort, a partnership held together by work, ritual, and a shared place at the center of national life. Even so, those murmurs, like dried petals pressed between the pages of a public life, remind us of the tension at the heart of royalty, a rarefied existence where love, longing, and loyalty are lived out beneath the unblinking gaze of the world. I don't see the expanded historical text you want me to transform. Please paste the exact text, the full passage you want rewritten for voiceover, and I'll get started. A few quick clarifying questions so I get it exactly right. Do you want a particular tone? Dramatic, intimate, neutral, investigative, or something else? What kind of narrator voice do you imagine? Warm, gravelly, calm, urgent, male, female, or gender neutral? Should I use British or American spelling and usage? Do any names, dates, or phrases need to remain verbatim beyond preserving all facts? You said the final story should be about the same length as the original. Do you mean roughly the same word count, or a target audio duration, for example? Minutes of spoken audio. Any other constraints? E.g., avoid modern slang. Include brief pauses or cues for music, or emphasize certain scenes or details. Once you paste the expanded passage and confirm those preferences, I'll produce a continuous, vivid, audiobook-ready narration that removes repetitions, smooths transitions, and adds tasteful descriptive touches while preserving every important detail. The press photos arrive in a steady stream, the familiar Getty Images credit blooming in the corner of each frame, and in them 2 figures stand at the intersection of public ritual and private strain. Princess Anne, the only daughter of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, is immediately recognizable, reserved, steady, carrying the quiet authority that comes from a lifetime in the royal orbit. Beside her stands Captain Mark Phillips, his posture the neat line of military bearing and polite composure the cameras expect. Together they make a picture that looks, from the outside, like the careful joining of 2 lives under watchful eyes. But the stillness of those posed images cannot hide what lay beneath. Behind the smile held for photographers and the polished appearances at official events, there was a different texture to their domestic life. A sense that 2 people who had once linked their futures were moving through a marriage that did not always find easy footing. Moments of formality sat alongside quieter, more complicated hours. Duties were kept, and courtly obligations met, even as the private seams of companionship frayed at times. You can almost feel the hush of stately rooms where conversation faltered, the small telling silences on drives between engagements, the way sunlight might catch the rim of a medal while a couple sat, politely apart, in the back of a car. The cameras caught them together often enough to record a partnership shaped by duty and expectation, yet sometimes strained by the private pressures that come with a life lived so visibly. Those recorded incidents are candid, not scandalous, quietly tragic in their own way, a reminder that beneath crowns and medals, relationships carry their own burdens, and not every marriage finds the ease its picture might promise. They were married in 1973, stepping into a new chapter with the slow swirl of vows and the fragile optimism that comes with any beginning. On the surface, the ceremony marked a shared life. The photographed smiles, the rings, the promise of togetherness. Yet over the years, the rhythm of their days told a different story. They lived under the same roof and bore the same name, but their lives drifted like two currents in the same river, close enough to touch yet moving in their own directions. Their mornings and evenings became a quiet choreography of separate rituals, small private routines kept at a discreet distance, friendships that rarely crossed the threshold, responsibilities that settled into their own lanes. To casual observers, the marriage appeared intact, a stable arrangement that had begun in 1973. Those who knew them better, though, could sense the two distinct worlds beneath that single household, parallel, persistent, and largely apart. In 1985, a new and unexpected line entered that private map. Phillips fathered a daughter, Felicity, with Heather Tonkin, a woman from New Zealand who made her life as an art teacher. Heather brought the sensibility of someone who worked with pigments and sketchbooks, a quiet, deliberate attention to color and form that shaped the way she saw the world and the child she raised. Felicity's arrival was small and ordinary in its beginnings, a crying infant, a stroller on a sunny street, and yet it began to complicate the neat separations the marriage had learned to hold. Felicity's existence threaded itself through the lives of the adults involved, a living fact that reframed choices and histories, even when it did not immediately alter outward routines. Her presence introduced new ties, new questions, and a different weight to what had once been only private habits. Relationships that had once been drawn in clean lines now contained echoes and cross-currents, subtle shifts that made the past look different when seen from the new vantage of a child's life. Then, 6 years later in 1991, a scientific truth made everything unmistakable. A DNA test, clinical, precise, and difficult to dispute, confirmed what had been suspected. Felicity was Phillips's daughter. The laboratory report closed a chapter of rumor with the cool authority of data, turning speculation into fact. For everyone involved, the confirmation was a turning point, an official acknowledgement that altered how the past would be understood, and how the relationships around it would be remembered. They officially divorced in 1992, and Princess Anne got remarried that same year to Timothy Lawrence, her current husband. The story of Prince Andrew and Koo Stark reads like a bright, brief chapter tucked into the long, formal book of royal life. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, he was still a young man finding his footing under the constant gaze that comes with being the Queen's second son. He had that boyish maritime look, a naval officer with an easy laugh and a charm that could be both warm and awkward, as if he were learning to be himself while carrying the weight of tradition. Koo Stark was different in every way that mattered to a prince. Raised on protocol, American-born, an actress and photographer, she moved through the world with a bohemian independence. She was used to shaping images as much as appearing in them, seeing life through a lens and framing moments on her own terms. When their paths crossed, It felt for a time like two separate worlds brushing against each other, palace rituals meeting the loose creative energy of the London arts scene. London then was a place of hum and heat. Clubs and cafes full of conversation, studios where films and photographs were made, and tabloids prowling for anything that sparkled. In that setting, their connection could seem both unlikely and inevitable. Away from the official calendar, they found ordinary comforts that the royal household rarely gets to keep. Long walks in quieter parks, conversations that lasted past the usual politeness, and the small private negotiations of two people learning each other's limits and desires. But privacy is a fragile thing for anyone linked to the crown. Their relationship was never immune to attention. Photographers were patient, and newspapers hungry. Images appeared in print, sometimes candid, sometimes intrusive, and every shared look in public grew into a headline. For Koo, who had known the professional glare of publicity, the tabloid assault was harsher and more personal. For Andrew, it was a stark lesson in what it costs to have a heart that lives in public. The pressure around them only intensified as gossip swelled and intimate photographs circulated. Those pictures did more than embarrass. They reshaped how people talked about the couple and made it harder for them to carve out a private life. The tug of public expectation, palace duty, and the search for a partner considered right for the royal household pulled on them in different directions. Gradually, the warmth cooled, and choices had to be made. Andrew would later move on to a different life course, toward a marriage that would itself become a public story. Koo, meanwhile, carried on with a life defined by creativity and resilience. She remained in artistic circles, increasingly known for her work behind the camera, as well as for what she had been in front of. A woman who had weathered the sharp edges of fame and gone on practicing her art on her own terms. Looking back, their affair feels human-sized against a backdrop of ceremony and headline-making events, a brief romance that shows how fragile intimacy can be when it's exposed to relentless scrutiny. It reminds us that behind every magazine spread there are real lives, laughter, doubts, small consolations, and the slow, sometimes painful process of choosing what comes next. Their story didn't end with the tabloids. It continued in quieter, more complicated ways, each carrying the memory of that brief connection into the years that followed. He was the late Queen's second son, a prince born into the soft, relentless glare of royal life, a figure both familiar and slightly mysterious to a nation that had watched his coming of age across newsreels and glossy magazines. For decades, Prince Andrew moved through a world of ceremony and tradition, along corridors that smelled faintly of wax and history, his life threaded into the very fabric of the monarchy. At private family gatherings, he was, by many accounts, the sovereign's reported favorite, a man who shared in the intimacy of a household the public could only imagine. But the sheen of privilege could not forever shield him. Over the years, his name became tethered to controversy, a recurring headline that refused to retreat into the background. The most notable of those associations was with Jeffrey Epstein, a financier already convicted and a figure whose name had come to signify a web of criminal infamy. What had once been society page footnotes, late-night visits, private acquaintances, were suddenly re-examined under a harsher, unblinking light. Into that light came grave accusations. Virginia Giuffre, who has said she was a minor at the time, accused Prince Andrew of sexual assault. Those claims reverberated far beyond the court of public opinion and marked a clear turning point in his life. The allegations drew an intense media focus and set off a chain of events that would radically reshape his public role and the way the monarchy managed its image. In an attempt to answer mounting questions, he agreed to a televised interview. What followed was widely described as a car crash, an awkward defensive hour that failed to settle doubts and instead amplified criticism. The images of that interview, the pauses, the strained explanations, the sense of being on the back foot, seeped into the national conversation and hardened public scrutiny. The matter then moved into the legal sphere, where it sought resolution through civil process. Ultimately, the case was settled out of court. That agreement avoided a jury verdict on the central allegations, yet carried its own weight. It closed one chapter without delivering the definitive judicial answer many wanted, and left other chapters forever altered by the shadow of controversy. Perhaps the most visible sign of rupture came from within the royal family itself. Under unprecedented pressure, and with the public calling for accountability, the Queen took the extraordinary step of removing her son from all official royal duties. The man who had stood at state occasions in naval uniform, who had been a familiar figure at palace engagements, was now stripped of the roles that had defined his public life for so long. What remained was a portrait of contrast, born to privilege and proximity to power, now living under the pall of allegations that would define his later public persona. The palace responded with hushed statements. Aides managed a constant churn of headlines, and the rhythms of official life adjusted to a new, uneasy reality. For the royal household, for a sovereign who had presided for decades with a steady hand, and for a country that watches its history unfold in public, this was a painful, complex chapter. It combined personal anguish, legal maneuvering, and the messy, unavoidable business of reputation in the modern age. A reminder that even the most gilded lives are not immune to the harsh glare of scrutiny. There are allegations that the Duke of York received significant sums from a London-based Turkish businessman, and the city of York voted unanimously to strip him of his honorary Freedom of the City. The headlines pile up, one after another, each new line folding into the last, until the whole story reads like a ledger of lost reputation. The list goes on. When that name is spoken, Prince Andrew, it carries a hushed, complicated weight. It lingers in rooms already full of rumor and its consequences. It arrives like a single letter pulled from a thick, heavy envelope and opened under a bright lamp. Mentioning him can shift the room's temperature, turning small talk into a pause, a glance exchanged across a table. The name itself becomes a kind of punctuation, marking a place where curiosity and judgment meet. Then imagine a voice that cuts through the varnish with a single, unsparing phrase. The journalist Eddie Mair, with his knack for slicing through spin, called him a nasty piece of work. Those 5 words do more than condemn. They sketch a portrait in miniature. Nasty tastes, sour and immediate, a moral shorthand. Peace suggests something you can turn over in your hands, examining fragments for pattern. of work points not to one mistake, but to repeated motion, the weight of habit. Spoken aloud, the phrase becomes rhythm as much as verdict, the consonants like small hammers, the cadence landing cleanly on the last syllable. It settles into public conversation the way a stone drops into a dark pond, sending out concentric ripples of judgment and curiosity. To hear it is to be invited into the scene. The hush after the line, the small intakes of breath, the way people lean closer to a radio, or pause mid-meal to register what has been named. It rides on the authority of the speaker without needing a list of grievances. Its power is shorthand, a hide-and-seek of meaning, where listeners fill in the edges. In that single, blunt turn of phrase, a complicated life is pared down to a moral outline, clear, memorable, and designed to linger long after the broadcast has ended. Wind the clocks back, and he was dating an American actress in the 80s, Koo Stark, remembered most for her role in the 1976 erotic film Emily. At the time, the match shocked some. An actress simply wasn't considered royal material, and the press pounced. The affair fizzled under that glare, and in 1986 Prince Andrew married Sarah Fergie Ferguson. That marriage, too, would be shadowed by rumors of infidelity on both sides, fed in part by the strain of Andrew's naval career and the long stretches he spent away from home. Ferguson later described those early years as lived at a strange remove. In the first 5 years of marriage, they saw one another only 40 days a year. Picture those meetings as small, combustible islands in a wide sea of absence. The hurried kisses in arrivals halls, the borrowed evenings in hotel rooms, the handfuls of hours that had to do the work of whole months. Each encounter carried the weight of a season, embraces that tried to stitch together distance, conversations that hurried to bridge silences, and little private rituals fashioned to preserve some sense of intimacy. They learned to measure life in those increments, counting down to the next visit, replaying the last, and carrying a single afternoon like a talisman through lonely weeks. That pattern, 40 days a year, year after year, shaped the rhythm of their marriage, a repeated compression of longing and reunion that made every shared hour both fiercely ordinary and quietly consequential. I'm ready to craft the narrated expansion, but I don't actually have the expanded text. You left a placeholder. Expanded, and I need to know which historical figures you mean. Which Sarah Ferguson and which John Bryan do you mean? If you don't have a specific pairing in mind, you can either paste the expanded text here, or tell me one of the following so I can proceed accurately. A short context or time period, for example, late 20th century British royal family, or any dates or the source the fragment comes from, or confirm you mean Sarah Ferguson, Duchess of York, born 1959, and specify which John Bryan and their relationship, or ask me to choose the most likely historical pairing. Once you confirm and or paste the expanded text, I'll produce the full voiceover-ready story at roughly the same length, and with the refinements you requested. The image that came to define a painful chapter in public life is impossible to forget. A single, infamous photograph of John Bryan bending towards Sarah Ferguson, his mouth at her bare foot, reproduced and scrutinized until it became shorthand for scandal. The snap freezes a moment that feels both intimate and improper. It captures emotion turned still, an act that should have been private made into an exhibit, so candid that it betrayed a closeness and a lack of discretion with consequences far beyond the room where it was taken. Looking at that frame, you see more than bodies and gesture. You see the collision of private longing and public consequence. The posture of the two people speaks of craving and consolation, of adults seeking comfort in an odd, unguarded way while the world watches. Because the woman in the picture was married to one of Britain's most visible royals, the photograph could not be contained. It leapt into headlines and conversation, taking on the weight of a symbol. No longer just a picture, it became proof, accusation, and gossip rolled into one. By 1991, the marriage between Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson was clearly strained. That simple sentence can't show the slow unraveling, the small slights, the nights apart, the different rhythms of two lives lived under constant public scrutiny. A marriage under such an intense glare is tested not only by ordinary pressures, but by the burden of always being watched and judged. Rituals of duty, the demands of representation, and the whispering of rumor press in a relationship until private rooms no longer feel private. There was a sadness to it that went beyond headline fodder. When two people's lives are threaded together under thousands of eyes, every misstep is magnified. Every comfort sought outside the marriage becomes raw material for commentators. The photograph of the toes came to stand, for many, as shorthand for that strain. A single, shocking piece of evidence that the ties between husband and wife had loosened enough for solace to be sought in an unguarded place. Behind the scandal, though, were human textures, loneliness, the hunger for warmth, the small rebellions people commit when they feel constrained. The image fed a narrative already forming in the background of public life. Editors rushed to press, conversations quickened from door to door, and the country sighed and speculated. For the two at the heart of it, the ordeal was more than a story to be endured. It became a private wound to be felt and reckoned with. That one photograph echoed through years of headlines and helped mark a turning point in lives that had once promised a very different future. Her friendship with Texan multimillionaire Steve Wyatt first drew wide attention when photographs of them were printed in newspapers in January 1992. That winter's publicity was soon followed by news of a different kind. The Duke and Duchess of York announced their separation on 19th of March, 1922, a public rupture that sent both their lives spinning into a harsher light. Barely had she begun to gather the scattered pieces of a suddenly altered private life, when the press turned their attention to an even more intimate moment. New pictures appeared, not in gossip columns but across the front pages, and the scrutiny that had always accompanied her accelerated into something colder and more invasive. It felt as if every seam of her life were being picked at, each small private detail stretched under the glare of public curiosity. The photographs themselves, printed in the Daily Mirror, were simple and stark. They showed American businessman John Bryan and the Duchess in a small private tableau. She sunbathing, topless, the summer light soft on her skin, and him close by, his face near her feet, his lips at her toes. What for the two of them had been an ordinary casual moment of trust and ease was transposed into ink and headline, stripped of context and reduced to a spectacle for millions. For anyone who has ever had a single private gesture turned public, the feeling is sharp and bewildering. A tender, fleeting action, the brush of a kiss against a foot, the lazy warmth of an afternoon suddenly becomes a thing to be dissected and debated by strangers. The image freezes the softness of sunlit skin and the small courtesy of a shared laugh. But the printed page magnifies everything into lines readers can stare at, judge, and pass on. The result was a new kind of exposure, one that left no corner untouched. The intimacy of that afternoon, once held between two adults, became a public commodity, circulated, examined, and reduced to a story. In the aftermath, there was no simple retreat back into privacy, only the long, slow task of rebuilding a life while the world watched every move. The backlash was swift when another royal scandal hit the headlines, and the British public even felt at times that titles should be stripped in the aftermath. Tabloid culture has a long memory. Figures like Sarah Ferguson found themselves the subject of relentless mockery, and that same unforgiving glare would shape how other women connected to the crown were seen and judged. It is against that noisy backdrop of rumor, outrage, and satire that the quieter, longer story of Charles and Camilla unfolds. They first found each other in a world that felt, for a while, arranged by fate. Green polo fields, country houses, and the soft, constant hum of aristocratic social life. In the early 1970s, a young Prince Charles, already marked out by birth for a life of duty, met Camilla Shand, lively, quick-witted, unmistakably herself. Their early meetings were threaded with small, intimate moments that, in hindsight, look like destiny. Shared laughter over tea, the casual ease of mutual friends, and a private understanding that made the world outside recede. They discovered in each other the simple pleasures of sport and the outdoors, horses, polo, long country gatherings, where, for brief stretches, they could be ordinary people away from the public gaze. But obligation has its own gravity. In 1973, Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles and began building a different kind of family, while Charles, drawn into public service, spent time in the Royal Navy and stepped toward the responsibilities that would define his life. Their connection never entirely vanished. It was folded into the patterns of two lives lived apart but not wholly separate, remembered in letters, visits, and the quiet knowledge they kept of one another. Time rearranged them into different roles, but it did not erase what had once been. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, that private texture became entangled with a new, very public story. Charles met Lady Diana Spencer, a young woman whose fairy tale bearing seemed, to much of the public, the perfect match for a future king. Their engagement and the wedding of July 29, 1981, were broadcast around the world. A modern romance staged on television, with millions watching as an heir exchanged vows amid white and pageantry. Diana was adored, appearing to offer the monarchy a warm, vulnerable face the public could love. Behind that shimmering image, however, lay a quieter and more complicated truth. Charles's old affections for Camilla threaded back into his marriage, and the pressures of fame and expectation, roles neither he nor Diana had fully chosen, placed unbearable strain on them. The tensions built slowly, and by the early 1990s had become impossible to contain. In 1992, the palace announced their separation, a formal recognition of private ruptures. Then came 1993, and the publication of intimate telephone transcripts between Charles and Camilla, a scandal that became known simply as Camilla Gate. The release of those private conversations turned personal choices into global spectacle. The marriage was legally ended in 1996, and a year later Diana's tragic death in Paris left a wound across Britain and the world. Camilla's life moved through its own transformations. Her marriage to Andrew Parker Bowles ended in divorce in 1995, closing one chapter and leaving another open. As the most intense storms of scandal and grief subsided, the relationship between Charles and Camilla began to emerge from the shadows. The public slowly learned to see them together without the same outraged intensity that had marked the 1990s. And the two of them learned how to inhabit a life where their relationship could be acknowledged more candidly. In 2005, they made that private rebuilding unmistakably public. Charles and Camilla were married on April 9th. The ceremony at Windsor Guildhall was civil and understated by royal standards, followed by a religious blessing at St. George's Chapel, a careful balance between tradition and the sensitivities that lingered from the past. Camilla adopted the title Duchess of Cornwall rather than Princess of Wales, a conscious gesture of respect toward Diana's memory. Over the following years, she settled into a role of discretion and steady effort, supporting charities, taking up patronages, and sharing in the representative duties that inevitably come with life beside the monarch. Time continued to change the scene. When Queen Elizabeth II died on September 8, 2022, Charles acceded to the throne, an event both constitutional and deeply personal. Camilla's title evolved with that transition. She became Queen Consort and, in 2023, stood beside him at the coronation. That public recognition marked the endpoint of a long, jagged journey. From adolescent intimacies in the early 1970s, through years of scandal and grief, to a settled partnership acknowledged at the highest level. At its heart, their story is human. Two people who knew each other through most of their adult lives, whose paths diverged and rejoined, who weathered reputation, scrutiny, and loss, and who ultimately stood together in the most public of roles. Their lives have been played out against the vast scenery of modern monarchy. Country estates and palaces, charity events and state occasions, the hush of private rooms and the glare of global attention. For those who watched, their tale has been at once a story of youthful connection, scandal and its consequences, endurance, and a companionship that survived corrosive public pressure. The image that remains is not simple. It is layered with the complexity of feeling and duty, a reminder that lives lived in public are always deeply shaped by private history, a history that across decades changed both of them and the institution to which they devoted so much. We've come to the big one. The words hang in the air like a held breath, a quiet declaration that marks a threshold. For Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles, this threshold was not a single door, but a string of doors they circled for decades. Thresholds of scandal and scrutiny, of private loyalty and public reinvention, of patience braided with pain. To tell their story is to listen for the small human moments beneath the headlines. A gentle touch on a windy terrace, a glance across a crowded room, the cost of loving someone when the world refuses to let you be simply human. They first moved into each other's orbit when Britain felt like a very different place. Young and bright in the early 1970s, they found one another amidst the promises of youth. Their names began to be spoken together in drawing rooms and on the back pages, and what started as companionship had the slow, stubborn growth of something deeper. Life, with its obligations and expectations, pulled them into other directions. Camilla married and became Camilla Parker Bowles. Charles followed the path set for a future monarch and married in keeping with duty. Both carried on with ceremonies and service, their days mapped by ritual and public obligation, even as a private thread linked them through the years. That quiet thread did not survive the glare of fame unchanged. When their relationship became public, it provoked curiosity and condemnation in equal measure, and the press turned private moments into theater. What should have been intimate was reconstructed under lights and headlines, and two marriages felt the strain of a nation watching. The clash of personal desire with public duty left scars that were visible in the papers and audible in the silences between formal appearances. Then there was loss, the death that shocked the world, and everything shifted again. Grief altered the rhythm of life, and out of it came a slow work of reconciliation. Years of cautious reappearances, friendlier photographs, and steadier hands softened attitudes. There was no erasing of what had come before. Rather, the couple outlasted the fury and settled into a different place in the public imagination. Less spectacle, more steadying presence. On 9th April 2005, in a small civil ceremony at Windsor, the story turned a corner that felt like the start of a quieter chapter. Surrounded by familiar faces and the old stones of the town, Charles and Camilla exchanged vows in the simplicity of legal formality. That afternoon was followed by a religious blessing at St. George's Chapel, where personal vows were folded into history. The royal trappings remained. Careful etiquette, watchful cameras, a steady protocol. But beneath them was a human scene. Two people, older and weathered by life's trials, choosing to stand together publicly and forever. What made that day notable was not only the pageantry, but the sense that private feeling and public acceptance had edged toward each other. It was a ceremony that acknowledged an unusual path, a love tested and maligned, gradually normalized by time and constancy. The photographs that followed, their measured smiles, the occasional laugh shared in public, suggested a partnership founded less on spectacle than on companionship, on the quiet work of being present for one another. Time kept moving, and with it the duties of the crown and the scrutiny that follows a royal life. Then, in September 2022, the nation witnessed another historic passage. With the death of Queen Elizabeth VI, Charles acceded to the throne. The moment was both constitutional and profoundly personal. A son becoming king, a family entering a new era. Camilla, who had stood by him through the long years, was styled queen consort. For many it felt like the completion of a long arc. From youthful meetings to public controversy, from private loyalty to formal recognition at the heart of the monarchy. Through all of it, the most moving thing is how ordinary the couple can look inside the ceremonial frames. Two people, not immune to frailty, navigating a life threaded with duty and desire. Their story resists tidy romance and reads instead as a complex human journey. Mistakes and resilience, grief and steadiness, a love that had to endure not only time, but the relentless attention of the world. When at last someone says, "We've come to the big one," what is being acknowledged is how history, private choices, and public life can converge in a single, resonant moment, intimate and national at once. quietly human within the sweep of monarchy. Prince Charles and Princess Diana were married on 29th July 1981, and the couple would go on to share a tumultuous 15 years together. That union was marked by jealousy. Diana told BBC reporter Martin Bashir in the now infamous 1995 Panorama interview that Charles resented the attention she received from the public and by the presence of a third party, which only made an already fragile bond harder to bear. The room felt small and bright under the glare of television lights, every camera lens a quiet window into a life being unpacked before the world. Diana sat with an honesty that cut through the polish of palace life, her voice steady, but threaded with the weary clarity of someone who had thought long, painfully, about the shape of her days. In that same interview she confirmed, simply and unadorned, that there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. Those words landed like a small sharp stone thrown into still water. The ripples reached far beyond the studio, because behind the spare sentence lay a whole constellation of private hurts and public consequences. She named, with cold precision, the person who filled that uninvited space: Camilla Parker Bowles. To speak the name aloud in that ordinary, intimate way was to lift a lid on a story the world had guessed at, but had never heard so plainly voiced. The phrase did not scream. It did not parade. It simply held a truth. What had been promised as a union of 2 had for years felt like an uneasy, crowded tableau. In the hush that followed, listeners could hear everything: the smallness of betrayal, the ache of exclusion, and the quiet courage of a woman turning private pain into a sentence the whole world could understand. In 1986, Charles began an affair with Parker Bowles, a relationship he later confirmed in his authorized biography, The Prince of Wales, and again in a 1994 interview with Aidila Tuon. The liaison continued for years, and in 1992 a private phone conversation between Charles and Parker Bowles leaked across the British tabloids, turning an intimate moment into public spectacle. The recording opens with a small, intimate pause, the kind that lets you hear the shape of a room and the weight of 2 people sharing it. There's a low, rueful laugh, the rustle of cloth, the soft hitch of someone trying not to take themselves too seriously. Little human sounds that sit before the words arrive and make the moment feel oddly ordinary. Then his voice comes through, threaded with exasperation and a private humor. "Oh, God, I'll just live inside your trousers or something. It would be much easier." The line lands like a joke, meant to disguise something bigger, a flippant answer to the endless complications that public life has a habit of making private. She answers without ceremony, a ready teasing retort that dissolves any pretense of solemnity between them. "What are you going to turn into? A pair of knickers?" Her tone is light but precise, a small jab that carries warmth, the kind of banter that can only belong to 2 people who know each other's moods by sound alone. He fires back with mock dismay, "Or God forbid a Tampax, just my luck." The phrase is both absurd and affectionate, an emblem of how ordinary humor can cushion the sharp edges of complicated lives. In the silence that follows, you can almost picture the shared smile, the subtle rustle of clothing, the brief moment when rank and duty fall away, and 2 people are simply being themselves, wry, tender, and defiantly human. According to the Sydney Morning Herald, royal biographer Anthony Holden later remarked that the intercepted phone call persuaded most of the nation that the heir to the throne, the would-be defender of the faith, was a lavatory-minded adulterer. That blunt line captured more than an insult. It crystallized a sudden humiliating image in the public mind of a man once thought to embody reserve and duty. For a time, in the early 1990s, the private life of the heir to the throne became a public spectacle, not with the quiet dignity one expects of royalty, but to the raucous, unforgiving laughter of a tabloid nation. The scandal, quickly christened Camilla Gate, spilled intimate, awkward moments into newspapers and onto airwaves, and whatever the precise facts of those conversations, their effect was unmistakable. A prince who had stood for duty and decorum was rendered the butt of jokes and sly caricatures. Photographs seemed to pin his dignity to the page. Cartoons exaggerated it away. The palace walls could not keep out the glare, and Charles's gravitas felt chipped and diminished in the court of public opinion. Behind the headlines, the marriage that had helped shape modern royal life revealed the same hard angles. The fairy tale narrative that had once captured the world's imagination was fraying in full view. In 1992, Charles and Diana announced their separation, a declaration that read like the closing of a long, complicated chapter. For the public, it was both a private rupture and a national drama, a personal grief played out under a bright, indifferent spotlight. The issue did not stay merely personal. It was pushed into the realm of state. People worried whether such domestic turbulence might have wider consequences for the institution itself. To steady a nervous nation, Prime Minister John Major stepped forward with clear, practical reassurance. They would be going their separate ways, and their split would have no constitutional implications. His words were meant to be a balm, a reminder that the machinery of government would continue to turn, despite private sorrow. Still, words could only do so much. The monarchy's moral stature had been tested in the most visible way imaginable, and the cameras and columns fed on every sign of strain. The public watched, debated, laughed, and sometimes mourned, drawn into a story that blurred the boundary between personal failings and public consequence. The separation appealed to the curiosity of a tabloid nation while exposing something more wearying, the erosion of a romantic ideal that many had invested in. By 1996, the legal ties were formally severed. Charles and Diana divorced, and the paperwork finally closed on a marriage that had been watched, hoped for, and mourned in equal measure. The end of the marriage brought an official finality to the public entanglement, but it did not erase the poignancy. What remained was the sense that this was one moment in a larger, quieter tragedy. Two people torn between duty and desire, between a shared history and separate futures. When Diana died the following year, the nation's response was immediate and intense, as if the country suddenly reclaimed the private heart that had long been on display. People mourned not only the princess, but the closing of an era, a chapter of high emotion, public scrutiny, and fractured myth. In the aftermath, the spectacle and the sorrow sat together, a reminder of how public life can strip intimacy bare, and how, in loss, a nation can rediscover the private humanity it had lost sight of. A single photograph can feel like a secret kept on film, 3 faces in one frame, each carrying its own quiet drama. On the left, James Gilby, a young man whose name would soon appear across gossip columns. In the center, Diana, luminous and guarded, the woman on whom a nation projected hope and curiosity. And on the right, James Hewitt, the cavalry officer who would later be named alongside some of the palace's deepest private failures. The picture looks ordinary, people smiling for the press. But behind it were lives that refused to stay simple. Diana's marriage to Charles lived always between duty and desire. Behind the palace curtains there was distance and difference, rituals to perform, roles to keep, and the private ache of companionship that didn't quite fit. Into that quiet, friendships and attachments took root. Some were casual consolations, some felt like lifelines. Each became, for better or worse, a small rebellion against the isolation that came with royal life. James Gilby belonged to the more domestic chapter of that story. He was a voice on the phone in long evenings, a friend Diana trusted with ordinary confidences. When recordings of their conversations leaked in the early 1990s, the intimacy of those calls was dragged into the light. Tabloids hung on the pet names and gentle banter, turning private warmth into public spectacle. For Diana, it was another sharp lesson. The smallest, most human gestures could be amplified into fodder for gossip, and privacy could be stripped away in an instant. The story with James Hewitt broke louder and more combustible. Hewitt was a soldier, confident, striking, used to command. And what began as a friendship became a passionate affair at a time when Diana was most vulnerable. Images of them riding together across open fields captured a kind of freedom she rarely felt within Kensington's gilded walls. The affair, which took place while William and Harry were still small boys, was later acknowledged by both Diana and Hewitt, and quickly became one of the most talked-about parts of her private life. A choice that may have offered comfort became, almost immediately, public calamity. Rumors followed like persistent shadows. The most damaging, the claim that Hewitt might be Prince William's father, found eager ears in the tabloids, even though the timeline made the accusation impossible. William was born before Diana and Hewitt's relationship began. Facts mattered less than sensation, and the denial did little to stem the emotional hurt. Hewitt, too, found himself trapped in the spotlight, trying to correct the record while the public imagination refused to let go. What links these episodes is not simply who loved whom, but what those relationships revealed about life inside the monarchy. Diana's attempts at friendship or comfort were reframed as scandal. Her simplest consolations were recast as betrayals. In that single photograph, Gilby's discreet presence, Diana's composed magnetism, Hewitt's assured pose, you can see a compressed story of a woman seeking connection wherever she could find it, and of a society that neither shielded her privacy nor resisted turning her choices into spectacle. The rumors did not appear out of nowhere. They grew from a marriage strained and displayed on the world stage, and from a human need to live, to love, and to be consoled under relentless observation. The faces in the photograph remain frozen on film, but the ache behind them lingers, a quiet reminder of how public life can fracture private moments, and of a woman who, in search of comfort, found her most personal choices judged before they could be understood. In the early 90s, a story the press called Squidgy Gate began to leak into public view. British intelligence was accused of recording a string of private phone calls between Diana and a man named James Gilby. On one tape, Gilby called her Squidgy more than 50 times. Those intimate, whispered exchanges were then sold to The Sun in Britain and later printed by the National Enquirer in the United States in 1992. A small, salacious echo of a life lived under constant scrutiny. By the autumn of 1995, the cameras were back, pointing at a woman who had spent years performing the flawless role expected of a princess. For the BBC's Panorama program, Diana chose a voice that was at once weary and astonishingly candid. The interview, billed as an extraordinary unraveling of private life in public, ran for nearly an hour and delivered something far more than tabloid fodder. It cut through the polite evasions that had long surrounded the royal marriage and landed in plain, undeniable terms. In that electric, intimate moment, she admitted what many had whispered about for years, that during her marriage to Prince Charles, she had had an affair. She named the other man, James Hewitt, a British Army officer. The confession fell with the quiet force of a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through palaces, sitting rooms, and newspaper offices alike. It was startling, not because it was shouted, but because it was offered as a simple truth, spoken with the steady tone Diana used when describing the cracks in her life. She did not turn her admission into spectacle. There were no lurid details offered for shock value. Instead, she acknowledged the relationship as one part of a larger, complicated life. To many listeners, the plainness of her delivery made the revelation harder to ignore. A woman simply naming what she had done and why, and refusing any longer to let others tell her story for her. James Hewitt's name stopped being a tabloid caricature and became part of the private geography of Diana's life. A household cavalry officer whose involvement would be dissected and retold. The confession shifted the narrative most people had accepted about the royal marriage. It forced an admission that fidelity, love, and loneliness had all played tangled, painful roles behind palace doors. Above it all was the unmistakable human note, the voice of someone who had lived with contradictions and at last chose to own them. That hour did more than disclose an affair. It changed how the world saw Diana. No longer just a princess framed by public expectation, she came across as a person with messy, painful choices and private attachments. Her words shaped public sympathy, intensified tabloid fever, and pushed official responses that culminated in the formal dissolution of her marriage the next year. Between the lines of her calm confession, listeners heard fatigue, the sound of a woman worn thin by having to perform a gilded role that had become a constraint. When historians look back on that interview, they do not focus only on the headline. They hear the tonal honesty Diana brought to the moment, a woman taking a truth that had been whispered for years and making it hers to speak. In doing so, she reshaped a story that had long been told for her, and in that voice the world caught a glimpse of the human cost of living in such bright, unforgiving light. He was a great friend of mine, at a very difficult, yet another difficult time, and he was always there to support me, Diana said. When asked if the relationship had gone beyond a close friendship, the princess responded, "Yes, it did, yes." He spoke quietly, as if the memory itself might startle. Hewitt insisted the story began in the soft, sunlit blur of 1986, a year that, in his telling, smelled of cigarette smoke and cheap cologne, of cassette tapes and shoulder pads, the kind of era where a whispered romance could feel private and eternal at once. When he said it aloud, the date landed like a small, hard stone in a still pond, a specific origin, a moment to which every recollection could be tethered. But memories do not stay private for long. When those revelations came to light, the hushed confession was picked up and refracted. Newsrooms, kitchen tables, and pub counters that treat gossip like the weather began to rearrange it into headlines. People who had never met him parsed his words, searching for motive and meaning. Some combed through old photographs. Others lingered over interviews and stray anecdotes, trying to stitch together a believable narrative from fragments. Attention then turned to something as ordinary and as arresting as hair. Hewitt's red hair, bright and unmistakable, became an emblem and a rumor magnet. In gossip's eager hands it acquired symbolic power, an obvious, visible link in a puzzle no one had been asked to solve. From one conversation to the next, the same idea resurfaced, persistent and invasive. Could that streak of copper be the proof some people longed for? What followed was not a measured debate, but a steady, almost mechanical rumor mill. The suggestion that Hewitt was Harry's real father moved through the world like a persistent current, appearing in barroom whispers and late-night telephone calls, in the silent knowing looks exchanged in corridors. It was insinuation made audible, repeated until it felt like fact to anyone who wanted it to be. The story that began with a claim about a romance in 1986 became, in its retelling, a tale dominated by a single, tangible image: red hair, and by the relentless, often unkind imagination of those who heard it. Following her divorce from Charles, Diana's life took a new and public turn. She was seen in a relationship with Egyptian film producer Dodi Al-Fayed, the son of Harrods owner Mohammed Al-Fayed, a brief, much scrutinized chapter that ended in tragedy. On 31st August 1997, Diana and Dodi were killed in a high-speed car crash in Paris, a loss that cast a long shadow over the family and the public who had watched her so closely. Against that backdrop of grief and scrutiny, William and Catherine's story began quietly, almost casually, at the University of St. Andrews. They met like a scene from a novel, two students wandering chilly Scottish lanes, ducking into cafes with textbooks, late-night study sessions stretching until dawn. William, the elder son of the Prince of Wales, carried the weight of expectation with a careful, self-effacing grace. Kate arrived with a steady, unfussy warmth and a quick, disarming smile. Their companionship grew from shared laughter and long conversations, the easy kind of friendship that over years became something much deeper. Their courtship wasn't explosive so much as patient and steady. Friends remember William's boyish affection shadowed by a sense of duty, Kate's practical humor and composure. The press followed them with growing intensity, a rhythm of private moments, periodically interrupted by the glare of cameras. When William proposed in October 2010, after years of gentle commitment, it felt like the natural next chapter in a relationship that had weathered scrutiny and distance. On 29 April 2011, Westminster Abbey was filled with sunshine and the prayers of thousands. The wedding was pageantry and tradition, a public spectacle threaded with personal meaning. For the couple it was, simply, a promise made in public. William was created Duke of Cambridge, and Catherine became Duchess. They moved into residencies heavy with protocol and began quietly and deliberately to build a family life that would be lived in part on a very public stage. Their children arrived one by one, and became the domestic anchors of that life. Prince George was born on 22nd July 2013, Princess Charlotte followed on the 2nd May 2015, and Prince Louis on 23rd April 2018. Each birth brought a surge of public relief and private joy, a reminder that behind the titles and ceremonies there were bedtime stories, scraped knees, and the small routines that shape a family. William and Kate tried to preserve steadiness for their children amid relentless attention, carving out ordinary moments wherever they could. Both found causes that reflected their private convictions. William trained at Sandhurst, served with the Royal Air Force, and worked as a search and rescue pilot. Experiences that gave him a disciplined, practical sense of service. Kate, who had studied at St. Andrews alongside William, developed a public focus on early childhood development and mental health, campaigning for practical support for families. Together they formed a partnership of public purpose and private care, photographed walking through playgrounds, visiting charities, and balancing ceremonial duties with hands-on parenting. But even the most luminous story can develop seams. The royal family itself, an institution that lives and breathes through generations, has felt strains in recent years. Brothers William and Harry, once close comrades through grief and youth, began to move on different paths in adulthood. Harry's marriage to Meghan Markle and their decision to step back from senior royal duties in 2020 changed the family's public geometry. They moved to North America and sought a different balance between obligation and privacy. What followed were a series of public reckonings that reshaped relationships within the household. Interviews, candid accounts, and later a memoir pulled private grievances into the open. The March 2021 interview with Oprah Winfrey by Harry and Meghan reached a global audience and altered perceptions. Then, in January 2023, Harry's memoir, Spare, added another intimate and controversial chapter. These events were factual and recorded, and they confirmed what many had suspected. A deep, complex rift had opened between the brothers, involving personal hurt, the pressures of modern celebrity, and the heavy expectations of a royal life lived in public. The distance between William and Harry has been visible not only in headlines but in quieter signs, photographs that feel guarded, rehearsed public statements, and silences that speak as loudly as any remark. There have still been public moments of warmth, but the undercurrent is one of strain, and those fractures have become part of the family's narrative just as much as weddings and christenings. Around William and Kate, tabloid chatter and modern rumors create near-constant noise. The media's appetite for drama, the small salacious stories that sell papers and clicks, can threaten to drown out the steadier truth beneath. Yet beneath the speculation is a more measured reality. Two people navigating spectacular responsibilities, trying to protect the private heart of their family while fulfilling duties that carry centuries of weight. Despite the glare, their public life has unmistakable tenderness. A glance exchanged across a stateroom, a protective hand on a child's shoulder, the small choreography of two parents doing their best in full view. These moments reveal a couple striving to hold on to normalcy. Their speeches and initiatives on mental health, wildlife conservation, and early childhood show a consistent effort to shape a modern monarchy that is compassionate and purposeful, responsive to contemporary concerns while rooted in tradition. Their story is not a single headline or scandal. It's a long arc of love and duty, ordinary family moments played out on an extraordinary stage. It is also, inevitably, part of a broader family drama of rifts and reckonings, reconciliation, and ongoing dispute, all documented in interviews and publications. Those events do not define the whole of their lives, but they are part of the texture of the present. Proof that even those who live in ceremonial pageantry are human, subject to the same complex loyalties and fractures as any family. Listen between the processions and the carefully worded statements, and you can hear the quieter work of a family trying to find its footing in a new century. William and Kate continue to work, to parent, and to present themselves with a calm often forged under pressure. Rumors will always hum in the background. They tend to wherever history walks beneath unblinking lights. But the core of this story remains. Two people bound by a childhood friendship turned lifelong partnership, stewarding a public role while trying, as best they can, to keep the private parts of life intact. Imagine a grey stone town on Scotland's east coast, gulls wheeling over the North Sea, narrow streets and cloisters where students hurry between lectures, wrapped against the chill. It was in that tucked-away place, amid late-night coffees and ordinary crowded days, that a young prince and a young woman began to notice one another. People like to tell it like a scene from a film. Casual glances in lecture halls, a text slipped between classes, the small accumulating moments that make strangers familiar. The moment most often replayed is cinematic in itself. A student fashion show, the hum of lights, the rustle of fabric, and a young woman walking a makeshift runway, briefly lit as heads turned. In that instant, William is said to have seen Kate, confident, composed, moving through the light. Whether a single look sparked something, or whether a conversation and the slow gathering of attention over weeks laid the groundwork, the image of that night has come to stand for the beginning of their story. Yet alongside the softer version of events, another narrative took shape. Colder, more calculating. From early on there was speculation that Kate had chosen St. Andrews with a view to the future, that she had placed herself where royal circles might converge. That idea, voiced by gossip and tabloids, turned a private student life into a chessboard move, not just a university choice, but a strategic placing of oneself inside of a possible royal path. It's important to say that this is speculation, a story stitched together from observation and assumption, rather than from the people involved. The press quickly took that thread and tightened it into a label. Waity Katie became a headline, a nickname that carried a sting, implying patient ambition and a willingness to wait for an opening. Tabloid columns leaned into that image, turning ordinary human behavior, waiting, hoping, persevering, into a moral judgment. Every postponed engagement or cautious step was read as evidence of calculation, and the private life of a student was replayed as public theater. So the tale that began among university cloisters became two stories at once. One quiet and human, born of shared jokes and late-night confidences. The other loud and speculative, shaped by rumor and relentless scrutiny. Both versions traveled beyond St. Andrews, and both have stayed with the public imagination, coloring how that chapter is remembered. In the end, whether you picture a chance meeting under electric lights or a plan quietly unfolding, the truth is that a private relationship entered a very public world, and along the way it was reshaped as much by gossip as by any single moment. For years there was a quiet, persistent murmur. The sort of thing that begins as gossip in corridors, at dinner tables, and in the soft corners of social gatherings, slowly gathering weight until it can no longer be entirely dismissed. Several rumors have circulated about William's infidelities over the years, most notably involving Rose Hanbury, a friend of Kate Middleton's. One of the louder whispers claimed he spent Valentine's Day 2023 with his mistress. Even without hard evidence, the rumor mill kept churning, and the tabloids in the UK fed on every fresh hint. Those murmurs never stayed small. They were repeated and amplified, becoming a recurring refrain not only in London society, but in foreign correspondence dispatches and on tabloid pages. The story fed on proximity to power, on people who had rubbed shoulders with the couple, on late-night confidences passed over drinks, on the brittle thrill of knowing something the public was not meant to know. In that way, the gossip took on a life of its own, shaped as much by who whispered it as by what was being whispered. Then one day the background noise sharpened into something louder. A Deuxmoi article landed and changed the tone. What had been private speculation was framed as a matter of public awareness. The piece declared the affairs an open secret in London, translating corridor talk into headline currency. When gossip steps onto a platform like that, it no longer feels like a rumor exchanged in hushed tones. It becomes a story with edges and angles, picked up and repeated until it seems undeniable. Woven into that exposure was a single line that stopped many readers in their tracks: the claim that Kate, confronted with the storm, doesn't mind her husband having affairs as long as things don't become emotional. That sentence, clinical and spare, acted like a lens, throwing the human shape behind the headlines into sharp relief. It suggested resignation or a private pact, perhaps a pragmatic survival under relentless scrutiny. Whatever the truth, those words changed how the public received the whole story, intensifying debate and imagination in equal measure. A whisper had become a broadcast. The intimate had bled into the national conversation. For a time, nothing about their lives felt merely private anymore. In the spring of 2022, a single post on a popular gossip feed set off a new ripple through the court of public opinion. Deuxmoi, that modern whisper mill, where anonymous tips arrive like confessions in the night, published an item that seemed to catch at something already loose in the air: curiosity, amusement, a hunger for scandal. The words themselves were short, the sort of thing that reads like a spark on dry tinder, but the response was immediate and loud. Online, the rumor grew teeth and a voice of its own. A salacious, mocking hashtag began to circulate, and overnight a private matter, unverified and unproven, turned into a public joke. From a distance it looked as if the scaffolding of a marriage might be creaking. Tabloid columnists and late-night commentators turned the rumor into copy. Social feeds churned with gifs and snark. Some treated it as harmless glee, a moment of collective mischief, but others saw the edges of something cruel. How quickly insinuation can be mistaken for knowledge. How easily a whole life can be summarized by a single, trending line. The online laughter felt bright and electric, but it left shadows where real people stood. Behind the headlines, reality remained quieter and more complicated. The people linked to the story kept their private lives private. No new facts emerged to turn rumor into truth. Still, the sensation of exposure was real. The imagined footsteps in empty halls, those guarded smiles at public engagements, the slow strain of being both performance and person on display. The rumor, and the hashtag that amplified it, proved nothing about the relationship except this: speculation can wound, and in a world so tuned to scandal, even the faintest whisper can be magnified until it sounds like thunder. What stayed after the noise was an uneasy impression that the marriage, as seen through the glare of public scrutiny and rumor, seemed far from the private contentment people hope for. Whether that impression matched the truth was never settled in public. What remained was an aftertaste of a story told loudly and without consent, a reminder of how quickly lives can be reshaped by whispers passed from hand to hand across the digital commons. There has been a steady thread of speculation about the rift between Princes Harry and William, and one theory points to Harry's disapproval of his brother's affairs, seen by some as echoing the same patterns that shadowed their father, Charles. That idea gained fresh traction with a single line in the Netflix documentary Harry and Meghan, when an estranged Harry dropped what many called a throwaway line: "We were happy to lie to protect my brother." For viewers hungry for answers, those words read like a smoking gun, a small flame fanned into a story. For centuries, the British monarchy has often felt like a stage where private sorrow is masked by public duty. Marriages were arranged or weighed down by expectation. Alliances were formed as much by protocol as by passion. Against that backdrop, when Harry and Meghan stepped into view together, their warmth looked almost revolutionary. Two people choosing one another, their affection plain in small, candid moments. The quick exchange of a glance, the casual warmth in a touch. In a family whose history can read like a ledger of compromises, that kind of openness felt like a relief, a quiet rebellion against an unhappy pattern. The public response was never going to be simple. For many, Harry and Meghan's union was a welcome change, a human story in a very public life. But the modern appetite for royal drama runs deep, and not everyone responds with sympathy. Some turn to satire instead of sorrow. On HBO Max, the animated series The Prince takes palace choreography and feeds it through a cartoon filter, flipping glossy pageantry into broad farce. It exaggerates rivalries, invents private snipes, and serves up caricatures, including an often prickly comic version of the William and Kate relationship, all in the spirit of a televised wink. Those caricatures are not history, they're jest. They're made to make us laugh at the idea of the royal household as a kind of sitcom, and they trade on clichés just as the tabloids trade on scandal. Between the tender, very human story of Harry and Meghan's attachment and the more jocular fictional barbs of animated satire, the image of the monarchy becomes unsettled and oddly compelling. It's a place where personal feeling and public performance collide. In the end, the modern monarchy sits in a strange, shifting landscape, equal parts romance and duty, devotion and compromise, reverence and ridicule. Whether people seek a heartbreaking confession, a hopeful love story, or a sharp gag, the royals provide a mirror for all of it, and the nation keeps watching, ready to read meaning into the smallest gesture. Confirmed or rumored, truth or hearsay. When it comes to royal romps, Many people simply don't care which is which. Whether the whisper begins behind silk curtains or under the hard glare of a street lamp, the tale spreads like a blaze, fed by curiosity, by desire, and by the delicious scandal of power laid bare. It moves fast, part fact and part fever, changing shape as it goes. In palace corridors, the staff exchange quick, knowing glances. In smoky taverns, the story grows louder with each clink of a tankard. In drawing rooms, the ladies hide smiles and let their teacups tremble just to see a blush. Poets pluck at the scandal for a line, lampoonists sharpen their pens to a finer point, and mothers hush their children only to lean closer and listen. Every corner of society finds a way to make the moment its own. The monarch's calm face, the courtier's furtive looks, the lover's careful footsteps through a moonlit garden. None of it needs proof to be vivid. Rumor dresses itself in costume and turns into a spectacle. Part entertainment, part moral trial, a mirror in which people see their own hunger for transgression and gossip. It performs for an audience hungry for both sin and judgment. What matters is rarely the certainty of the deed. It's the way the story changes the air. Conversations tilt. The dinner table jokes grow sharper. Stares linger a fraction too long. Small social forces pull and tug. A sly aside here, a knowing silence there, and the world rearranges itself around a rumor. In the end, whether a scandal is written down in a careful ledger or only carried on a single breath, these stories feed a public appetite that survives long after the actors are gone. Time and tombs may cover names, but the taste of the tale and the way it stirred a people is not easily buried. More often than not, a flicker of gossip, a half-formed whisper or a careless rumor is scooped up and polished until it shines, not because it is true, but because it sells. Royal columnists and red-top tabloids, hungry for headlines and clicks, feast on ambiguity. They amplify error with the surety of vultures circling a promise of profit. An inexact quote becomes a scandal. A grain of suspicion swells into an entire narrative. In newsrooms where copy is king, nuance is expensive, and speed is everything. Photographs are cropped for drama. Passing gestures are read as confessions, and private grief is reshaped into public spectacle. The machinery of rumor is both ancient and modern, from the hot type of broadsheets to the instant churn of digital feeds. And its appetite for the intimate lives of the royals remains relentless. A single image can change a story's direction. A hand on an arm, a sideways glance, a train slightly askew. Small moments magnified until they seem charged with meaning. Reporters and commentators stitch those fragments together into tidy narratives because audiences want certainty, and certainty sells better than ambiguity. The result is a ceaseless demand for interpretation. Where there was once a private heartbreak, there is now a headline. Where there was a quiet disagreement, there is a supposed falling out. The bright lights meant to flatter the monarchy can just as easily burn away privacy until the personal becomes, by force of repetition, public. And yet, for all the pageantry, royal marriages seldom rhyme with simple marital bliss. Behind the lace veils and gilded facades, human frailty and the weight of duty have produced some of the most wrenching and public ruptures of modern life. Weddings that glow in portraiture are often negotiated as much by law, lineage, and expectation as by feeling. Monarchs and heirs must learn to balance private longing against a public role that lives constantly in the glare of scrutiny. The heart's weather is measured against the state's calendar. Alliances once arranged to secure dynasties have sometimes withered under the pressures of politics, clashing personalities, and the simple fact that two human beings rarely conform perfectly to an institution's blueprint. The whole thing becomes a strange theater. Oaths taken at altars are replayed on newsstands. Bouquets tossed into carriages are followed by whispering columns that refuse to let the story rest. Inside the household, the ritual continues. Processions, portraits, state dinners, an outward composure that masks private strains. Outside, the public, ravenous for narrative, fills silence with conjecture. When the monarchy is quiet, speculation rushes in to take its place. So royal marriages are lived out in two worlds at once, in gilded halls and chapel aisles, and on the front pages where every clasped hand and distant glance can be given a meaning far larger than the moment that produced it. It is a pattern as old as monarchy and as new as today's breaking alerts. Pageantry and intimacy entangled, the long, complicated business of love under the public eye, rarely, if ever, quite the picture of bliss.